All right, good morning. Most of you know me, and let me just start by saying it's so good to be home. And I know I tell you that every time I'm here, but this has always been home for me. And if you're getting to know us for the first time, I spent 6 years here with Paul, studying to preach full time, and during that time, you just became our family, and so this is always home. Now, Paul, if you don't know him very well, he'll get lost in his own backyard, and so he misspoke when he said Fort Scott, Iowa. I'm sure he meant Fort Scott, Kansas. Tomato, I guess. Fort Scott's southeast corner of Kansas, about 10 minutes from Missouri, about 45 minutes from Oklahoma. And I'm bivocational in that I'm a sergeant with the Fort Scott Police Department in addition to being a full-time preacher. But I wouldn't be anywhere in Iowa or Seattle if it had not been for Paul. And I appreciate Mom and Dad coming up to worship with us this morning, and the Radkeys made the journeys down from the outer reaches of the universe, and it's just good to be here with you this morning. And when I told Paul we were coming to meet our granddaughter, I told him, so I'm going to be here on this particular weekend. How about I give you the weekend off? He said, well, I'd sure appreciate that. And that turned out to be providential because Paul has had a week, or he's been up to his elbows in crocodiles. So glad to be able to give you the break, and I appreciate the opportunity to come and preach a lesson to old friends and new ones alike. And so let's go ahead and get into our lesson this morning. On the board it says Learning from Eli, but the real title of the lesson is Parenting Lessons from Eli. So if you'd like to turn your Bibles, your tablet, your smartphone, whatever you got, go ahead and turn on over to the book of 1 Samuel. And that's where we'll get our study text this morning. And here in 1 Samuel chapter 2, in verses 22 through 25, this is where our primary study will take place this morning. And the Bible says, now Eli was very old, and he heard that his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they lay with the women and served at the doorway of the tent of meeting. He said to them, why do you do such things, the evil things that I hear of from all these people? No, my sons, for the report is not good which I hear the Lord's people circulating. If one man sins against another, God will mediate for him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who can intercede for him? But they would not listen to the voice of their father, for the Lord desired to put them to death. So as you think about what the Bible has to say about Eli and his rebellious sons, consider this, that a man might be a good man on the whole, but even good men have defects, don't they? Even the best of men that you know have shortcomings and flaws. You might think about that as you might consider putting more elders back into place before too long, that not all men are perfect. Everybody's got flaws and shortcomings. And Eli was such a guy. Eli was a guy who was a good man for the most part. But he had some defects. What we know about Eli is that he was a descendant of Ithamar, who was the youngest son of Aaron. And because he comes out of Aaron's family tree, he was a high priest. And we know that he was one individual who helped raise young Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 4, verse 18 tells us that Eli became a judge at 58 and that he ruled Israel for 40 years. Now, I went to public school, but my math tells me that makes him a very old man when he's a high priest serving the Lord. Supposedly about 70 when he's first mentioned in the Bible as being a high priest. But if he's an old man and his young sons are referred to as young men, then what you have is you have an old guy with young sons. And that's going to be part of the problem here, why these young men are the way they are. Now, even though we can say, well, here's some really good things about Eli. He did this, and he was a high priest, and he helped raise Samuel, and he served the Lord all these years. But what is he most known for? When you think of Eli, what do you think of? You think of a guy that had rebellious sons, don't you? And so his sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were as corrupt as they could possibly be. And the Bible says that they did not know the Lord. Now, what we're going to talk about this morning is Eli's feeble attempt, that is, to rebuke his sons. But as he did so, it's really kind of ineffective, and I'll explain in a little while why that was. And because his rebuke of his sons was lame at best, then God is going to pronounce judgment on Eli and his whole household. And so the Lord told Samuel the reason why such judgment would take place, and you read about that in 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 11 and 14. And here's what the Bible has to say. It says, the Lord said to Samuel, behold, I'm about to do a thing in Israel at which both ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. In that day I will carry out against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. Verse 13, for I have told him that I am about to judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knew, because his sons brought a curse on themselves, and he did not rebuke them. Therefore I have sworn to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house will not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever. And so the key point I want you to get out of our introduction this morning is that Eli's attempt to rebuke his sons was not only ineffective, but it also didn't absolve him of his responsibility as a parent. It didn't absolve him of the culpability of his son's behaviors. And so keep that in mind as we move forward this morning. The first thing I want to point out is that as Eli rebuked his sons, it was not done in a timely manner. In other words, it was not administered at the proper time. So what we'll do is we'll have a series of contrasts and comparisons. We'll look at Eli and his sons, and then we'll look at how we can apply this ourselves. So with regards to Eli and his two boys, his son's propensity for sin must have been seen long before the rumor started flying around. Because if you go back and read the text, what is Eli really concerned with? What the people are saying. Sons, what is this I hear that the people are saying? Please tell me it's not true. But you can't tell me he didn't know. It was evident his sons didn't know the Lord. Yet, here's the thing. He's the high priest. What are they? They're serving as priests too. They're serving as priests, but they're as crooked as could be. They're not faithful to God. These are evil, wicked, rebellious young men. And Eli, being old, weak, and fragile, must have been pretty easy on the boys. That's typically how it is when you are an older man and you have younger children. Because as we get older, we tend to be a little more soft going, And I look at my dad. When I was a kid, I was scared to death of him. Now he's just a big bear, a big teddy bear. He don't scare nobody. And so, as Eli is aging and quite aged, having younger sons, he was probably easygoing, mild-mannered, don't want to rock the boat with them sons. And so he failed to reprove them until they were far too gone down the road. That's the situation you've got. You've got an old dude, young men, and they are so far gone, and he's too weak and fragile to really reprove them effectively. And this is kind of how it was with David and his son Adonijah. In 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 6, it says, his father had never crossed him at any time by asking, why have you done so? And he was also a very handsome man, and he was born after Absalom. Well, you can say all kinds of things about King David. David, I don't think, was the greatest parent ever. We'll say more about that in just a little. But here's just one instance where David didn't correct or rebuke one of his boys. And that son was Adonijah. Now, how does this apply to us? Well, what we need to keep in mind is that the tendency to go wrong starts at a young age. Look, I tell you, I've been in police work. This is my 29th year. And I'd be a rich man if I had $1 for every time a parent came to me with their teenager and wants us to fix them. I say, this didn't start last week. It didn't start last month. This started when this child was small. And now you want me to untangle 13, 14 years of poor parenting? Sorry, that's not what the police do. That's not our job, by the way. We're not surrogate parents. We don't fix problems like that. Nolan will tell you, you've had that many times, haven't you, Nolan? So when kids start going awry, it starts young. And that's when parents need to hey, what do we need to change to, fix this? One guy said, a little plant may be easily rooted up, but when it becomes a tree, it can only be removed by extraordinary efforts. Well, isn't that true? Some children, though, can be discouraged by too much strictness. And I want you to notice, dads, what Paul has to say to you in Colossians chapter 3, verse 21. He says, fathers, do not exasperate your children, so they will not lose heart. And what I'm getting at is, you have to have discipline in the home. But can you have too much discipline? Yeah, absolutely. You can be so tough and harsh on your kids as to drive them away. You can break their spirits. You can cause them not to want to, you can cause them to be rebellious by being too strict and heavy-handed on them. And I want you to notice, dads, Paul didn't write this to moms. This is not an admonition to mothers. It's an admonition to fathers. And moms, you need to let dads be accountable for this stuff in the house. Because if you go over to Ephesians chapter 5, and I know it's not a popular passage socially, but Paul says, in comparing the church to marriage, that is, that the church is the bride of Christ, and in the same way that Christ is the head of the church, the husband's the head of the house, God made husbands culpable for the family. He didn't put that responsibility on moms. He gave it to dads. Is it any wonder that the average American family is wrapped around the axle? Because we have dads who are either physically absent and have absconded from the family, or we have dads who are just, they're there, but they're not present. Did you know that over 90% of all men in prison have dads who are not present? It shows the importance of fathers in the life of their children. And I feel like as a society, as a culture, We have taken that from husbands. We have taken that from dads. And dads, you need to recognize your God-given responsibility and authority and culpability within your family. And moms, you need to let them be culpable. You need to let them be responsible. Don't subvert your husband from his God-given authority and responsibility. So some kids can be hurt by too strict a house, but you can also hurt your kids by being too lenient. You know, what I call permissive parenting. You can be a permissive parent and ruin your kids in the same way as if you're an iron-fisted, heavy-handed parent. One person said, indulgence never produces gratitude or love in the heart of a child. That's true. When you are a permissive parent and you just give your kids whatever you think is going to make them happy, you're not raising children that are going to appreciate what you've done for them. And for those of you who know my children, you know, Paige, Hannah, Mandy, all worked at McDonald's over here. They all had to help pay for their cell phones. They all had to help pay for their car insurance. And all the while, if they wanted to do their school activities, those were separate things. You want to drive? Good. We'll teach you to be responsible. And they all bought their own cars, by the way. Paul, you'd be interested to know, I've got an update on the Ford Pick-em-up from Hannah. I'll tell you about it later. Proverbs 13:24, he who withholds his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him diligently. And I think we've lost this in our culture. If you love your children, you'll discipline them. You'll hold them accountable. Because if you don't, God says you pretty much don't love your children if you're going to let them just do whatever. Because children left to their own devices will do what? They'll find trouble, won't they, Jim? I tell you what, I hope I've got enough time to fit this in. When Mandy came back from her first deployment and moved from Bremerton to Virginia Beach, she called me crying. I'm like, why are you crying? Well, Dad, I don't know what to do with myself. What do you mean you don't know what to do with yourself? Well, on the ship, everything's very regimented. You're told what to do, when to do, how to do it, and now I'm here in my own apartment. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. This 22, 23 years old, first apartment on her own. I'm like, you should be excited. Instead, she was terrified. And what that proved to me was that I've always felt like kids like being in the box, whether they admit it or not. They like to know what the boundaries are. It makes them feel safe to know where the boundaries are. And here's my daughter saying, Dad, I like the boundaries. She's gotten over it now, but for several months there, she struggled living on her own, not having somebody tell her what to do and what time to do it. It's a real thing. All right. The second point I want to make this morning is that Eli's rebuke of his sons was not given with enough earnestness. It wasn't tough enough when he gave it to them. So in the case of Eli and his sons, what you have is that when he rebuked them, it wasn't sufficiently pointed in its application. It was given to them collectively rather than individually, first of all, and really by way of rhetorical question than as a direct charge. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 23, and tell me what that reads. You'll see it's more of a question than it is a, hey, you guys are not doing the right things. That's not what he said. He was more worried about the things he had heard, and he didn't take the time to find out for himself. He's more worried about the rumors going around than he is trying to set his boys straight and get them on the straight and narrow. And also, if you read the text, you'll discover that Eli's rebuke of his sons demonstrated no sense of urgency about the level of sin that they were engaged in. It's almost as if, I'll address it a little bit, but I don't want to get too deep into the details. It's almost like he dismissed it a little bit. He was dismissive in the way he approached it. And so he spoke of consequences rather than the nature of their sin, And he seemed to be more worried about reputations than the actions that are being engaged in. That is a parent who is not only permissive, but is worried about his reputation in the community more so than what the boys are up to. It also demonstrates that in his attempted rebuke of his children, that there's nothing there about changing the behavior. Right? It showed no sufficient determination to correct the sin. He did not threaten to judge them for their injustice towards their fellow man or for their sexual immorality. And it reminded me of David's attitude towards Amnon after he raped his sister Tamar. All it says in the text is that David was angry about it. David heard about it, he got mad, end of story. It makes you wonder, why didn't David take that young man out and deal with him according to the law of Moses? Why didn't David take him out and have him stoned for his treacherous behavior? I don't know. I can't. Someday I hope to be able to ask David, because you got to remember, this is a man after God's own heart, but still, sometimes David's actions are befuddling. And I think in how he handled Amnon, or didn't, is really one of David's greatest blunders ever. Was he worried that Amnon would point out to him, say, well, Dad, what about you and Bathsheba? What about that, Dad? Was he worried Amnon would bring that up? I don't know. I don't know why David didn't deal with Amnon. But the way that Eli dealt with his sons is just like David and his son. And I'd already pointed out to you, this is not the first time David has treated his kids with kids' gloves. I guess would be the way to say it, right? And they were men, so they could have been dealt with appropriately. As far as Eli is concerned, he left them the judgment of a higher tribunal. Labass is a commentator, and I like the way he said this. I'll read it to you. Labass says that in the case where the rebuke should have descended like a bolt from heaven, we hear nothing but low and feeble murmurings coming, as it were, out of the dust. Cruel indeed are the tenderest mercies of parental weakness and indulgence. And the fate of Eli shows that by such tender mercies the father may become the minister of vengeance unto his own house. So, for us, we need to remember that our reproofs should be pointed, direct, and sufficient in pointing out the problem at hand. Such was the case when Nathan rebuked David. Remember that? David, you are the man. And David said, you know what, I've sinned against God. But Nathan's rebuke of David was direct and to the point. And the thing that always stands out to me about Nathan's rebuke of David is David repented. Nathan says, well, God forgives you, but David, there's a consequence for your behavior. It's what Paul and I have referred to as the law of second and third consequences. Nathan says, the sword will never leave your house. Boy, wasn't that true? And David would go on to have much familial problems because of his sin with Bathsheba. But when we are going to point out somebody's sin, we need to communicate just how evil sin is and the consequences of sin. We need to make every effort within our realm of control to stop the sin from being done. And you can do that by gently pointing it out. But you can be gentle but still direct, right? You don't have to sugarcoat it necessarily. You don't have to hold it back, say, look, I've heard or I saw you X, Y, Z, and how about we help you fix that? Third point is that Eli's rebuke of his sons was not followed with adequate chastisement. So in the case of Eli and his sons, You know, the law of Moses had laws for how to deal with disobedient children. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 18 to 21. If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey his father or mother, and when they chastise him, he will not even listen to them, then his father and mother shall seize him and bring him out to the elders of the city. Then all the men of the city shall stone him to death. What should have David done with Amnon? What should Eli have done with his sons? You correct them. If they don't change, you take them to the elders of the city. And we go from there. Eli didn't observe the law of Moses. 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 25, but then neither did David. The other thing we notice about Eli is that he didn't take any further steps to prevent the continuance of evil, which he was allegedly trying to disapprove of. Should they have continued to serve in their capacity, knowing the evil that they were engaged in? No, but Eli doesn't seem to be concerned with that. He's concerned with reputations. What we learn about Eli is that he did not have the zeal for which Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, disapproved. You remember that in Numbers chapter 25? There was some fornication going on there, right in the opening of the tent, and he went over and he speared those two people. And God says, "I like that guy. He's got my kind of zeal for truth, for the law." And as a high priest and a judge, what Eli was guilty of is he was guilty of culpable infirmity and willful disobedience by not properly chastising and correcting his sons. One guy says of, I guess it's pronounced Acacia, which is a type of tree, I guess it's very flexible. Says one guy, he says, Acacias can never serve as pillars in the state or in the church. And I thought about Eli, and I thought, well, that's a good illustration. Now, for you and me, what this means is that fathers who love their children, remember, dads, this is your responsibility, by the way. You will chastise them appropriately. Consider the Hebrew writer, chapter 12, verses 6 through 8. Those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines, and he scourges every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you endure. God deals with you as sons. For what son is there whom the Father does not discipline? But if you are without discipline, of which all have become partakers, then you are legitimate children and not sons. So what do you do if you love your children? You hold them accountable. You give them boundaries, and then you hold them accountable. If you want to earn the respect of your children, then you will do so. If dad says, if mom says, well, you had better have some follow through or you're in for some choppy waters. Fathers are in a position to restrain their children's sinful behavior. And not only are you in a position to do so, you have a duty and an obligation to God to do so. And I don't care if it's at church, at school, in the community, or wherever they are, in the home. Dads, you have that culpability. Real quickly, last point. Eli's rebuke of his children didn't result in any change, did it? Their contempt and reproof, or their contempt of reproof, revealed that they were already hardened to sin. They were already infatuated with what they were doing. And so God gave them up to destruction. And in them, in Eli's sons, the Proverbs 15 verse 10 is really comes to fruition, says that he that hateth reproof shall die. These two young men like being corrected or reproved? No. So God says, I will judge them. For you and for me, if we wait too long, there comes a time when it just might be too late. Too late can be too late. It's too late to bring someone back. Because as we read in Romans 2:5, Hebrews 3:12 through 13, it is entirely possible for people to get so far gone down the line that they just get too hardened to sin. Because of your stubbornness and unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath for yourself in the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment. Hebrews 3:12 and 13. Take care, brethren, that there are not any one of you an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God, but encourage one another day after day, so long as it's still called today, so that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. And again, I want to reiterate the point that an individual can reach a point where they just get so far away from God, so hardened to sin, so entrenched in where they're at, that it's almost impossible to bring them back to repentance. All right, give me just a minute to recap and conclude this message for you, and then Mike will have you come lead the song of invitation. As parents or pillars of the church, reproof is a solemn obligation. Nobody likes having to have a conversation with an individual or your children. But if you do, and you find that it's something that must be done, it should be done in an effective manner, and done so in a way so that we're not doing more harm than good. You can correct somebody with a gentle spirit, with love and kindness, but you can still be direct, such as Nathan was with David. Number 2, when a rebuke or reproof is justly given, it should be done humbly. It should be received obediently, as Eli did when he accepted the Lord's judgment. It's hopefully it's done before it's too late. And how sad that Eli could accept reproof but not give it. And that's one of the points here that needs to be made. He was able to accept it, but not give it. Let me give you just a couple passages to noodle on as we close this morning. Proverbs 13:24, he who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly. Proverbs 19:18, chasten your son while there is hope. Do not set your heart on his destruction. Proverbs 29:15, the rod and rebuke give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother. Proverbs 29:17, correct your son and he will give you rest. Yes, he will give you delight to your soul. It's been a joy to be with you this morning, and I hope that this message has been well received by you and that you find it helpful to you. If you're here this morning and you need to obey the gospel by being baptized for forgiveness of sin, everything's ready to go. We'd be happy to help you with that. Or if you're here this morning and say, you know what, I need the prayers of the congregation. I've been struggling. Maybe I haven't been parenting as well as I could. And we'd be happy to pray with you and help you. So whatever we can do to help you, come forward as we stand and sing the song Invitation.
It's